Thank you, Mr. Attorney General. Thank all of you for this opportunity and thank all of you for this day. For decades, the American people have been exposed to incredibly toxic forever chemicals known as PFAS with no protection from their government. None. Those chemicals now contaminate virtually all Americans from birth. In fact, before birth, as our study in 2004 documented. That's because for generations, PFAS chemicals slid off every major federal environmental law like a fried egg off a Teflon pan. Until Joe Biden came along. Until Joe Biden came along. Now we're making progress and we can't go back. We can't go back. In just the last few years, for the first time, most of those environmental laws are starting to stick to forever chemicals. How about that? Right? And today, EPA announces the biggest step yet, a tough landmark legal limit on PFAS in the drinking water of tens of millions of Americans. Unprecedented progress. We can't go back. Next month marks the beginning of the Environmental Working Group's focus on forever chemicals, 25 years ago. We just turned 31, as you can probably tell. The reason we started, and in a real sense, the reason we're all here today, is because one man stood up to a multi-billion-dollar company, slogged through decades of government neglect, and pulled back the curtains on the global crisis of PFAS contamination. That man is Rob Bilott. He's right back there. As listeners know by now, I'm prone to having episodes, and one of the true episodes of my career started with an article in the New York Times. This was an article that appeared in May of the year 2000, so going on a quarter century ago. And it has to do with what we now call forever chemicals, these PFAS chemicals. This was a story that appeared on page C3. And in this story, David Barboza, the business reporter for the New York Times, says that EPA had a different version of events than 3M had announced just days earlier. Namely, 3M said they were going to change the chemical that was in their incredibly profitable line of products that was marketed under the name of Scotchgard. And they were getting rid of the chemical. You know, it sometimes showed up in people, and they wanted to offer something different to their customers and so forth, even though it was going to cost them, I think they said $200 million in the first year. That's a very good corporate citizen that would do that just for its customers and just because there might be an environmental problem. But a few days later, what happened was someone from EPA called the New York Times and told them that's not really the story. The real story is that 3M was actually forced by EPA's threat to ban the chemical or regulate the chemical at minimum. And 3M wanted to avoid that for all kinds of reasons. And our guest today will talk about it because this article was also, I think, incredibly influential in his career path, his decision-making as the attorney who became DuPont's worst nightmare. Not eventually, maybe I think you bothered 3M quite a bit too, Rob Bilott, but at first it was DuPont. This was a cover story 18 years later in the New York Times Magazine. Okay. And here we're seeing Rob standing in a field. Is it the field at the farm where you found the problem? Did they take you out? Were you out there?
It was the Tennant Farm out in West Virginia.
The Tennant Farm. Well, Rob Bilott is one of the most important figures in environmentalism in our century. I have known Rob for some years now. When I read that article in the New York Times, I directed my colleagues to go to EPA and find out what documents were being referred to, what studies were being referred to that showed this chemical, which at the time we didn't know it, but it was something called PFOS. It was showing up in people around the world, the document said, and that got my attention. It was showing harm to animals. In fact, during laboratory studies, the animals were dying, actually dying during the experiment. That's generally considered a pretty serious health effect. It was also showing up in wildlife around the world. It was a big deal. A few years later, there's a documentary film, The Devil We Know, that really tells the story of Rob's crusade to hold DuPont accountable. And I strongly recommend this documentary film. It's marred by the fact that I appear in it, but other than that, it's got a lot to recommend it. And then, of course, Hollywood. Mark Ruffalo himself called you, Rob, and said, I want your story to be memorialized in a Hollywood treatment. And so my guest today on the podcast is Rob Bilott, actually one of the most important environmentalists, as I say, just because of the way he has wielded law and how he has engaged in advocacy going way back to even before, I think, that article appeared in the New York Times or right around that time. His book, Exposure, if you wanted to read one book to understand how environmental policy is made in the United States these days and the difficulty of making good environmental policy, this would be the book to read. It's beautifully written, and I can't recommend it highly enough. I refer to it still all the time, and it tells the story of how Rob discovered these forever chemicals, their saga, which is now a globally recognized crisis. Rob has been all over the world. You're always in an airport or often at an important meeting or in a courtroom. But the fact of the matter is, Rob is the person who is responsible for really making this issue the critical concern it is today, and it has changed environmental policies. Thanks for spending some time with me today. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thanks so much. It's terrific to be here with you, Ken.
Yeah. So you had sued on behalf of a family in West Virginia, a cattle farmer, beef cattle, and his whole herd had died right below a landfill where DuPont had dumped this chemical that was a mystery to you at the time. It took you months, if not years, to figure out that it was the Teflon chemical.
Right.
But that article, when you read that, that was a piece of the puzzle you were trying to solve, right?
It was. We had first started in on this entire forever chemical saga back in the fall of 1998 when Mr. Tennant, the farmer in West Virginia, had come to us trying to figure out what was in this white foam coming into the creek that his cows were drinking from. And that had led us to start a lawsuit against DuPont back in 1999. This was a landfill permitted by the state of West Virginia. So there were permit limits, about the different types of chemicals that could be emitted or released from the landfill. And there were limits. And so we thought it would be straightforward. We'd pull the permit, we'd look at the reports, and there's probably something exceeding some limit there. And we'd get to the bottom of it pretty quickly. Well, didn't quite turn out that way. We pulled the permits and nothing really was exceeding the permit limits, and nothing really would explain that foam. And so what we started doing was asking the company for documents beyond the permits. We wanted to know everything going into that landfill. And we started into what we lawyers call the discovery phase, getting all these documents from the company. And those who have seen the films, either Dark Waters or The Devil We Know, you saw those boxes rolling in. It's the way it happened back then. It was before everything was on computers. Yeah. So all this paper starts coming in, and I start seeing these references to a chemical called PFOA, which I never heard of. And it wasn't on any of the lists that I had as an environmental lawyer of hazardous materials, hazardous substances, toxic. It wasn't on any of those lists.
An environmental lawyer whose practice was defending companies that faced environmental challenges, right?
Absolutely. I was working primarily with big chemical companies helping them navigate what I thought I understood pretty well, which was the world of all of the, anything that was bad. There were EPA limits, and they would tell you how much you could put into the air or into the water, or how much could go into the landfill. So as long as you were complying with those rules, you were doing what you needed to do. So that's why I thought I'd be able to help resolve this pretty quickly. This was a permitted landfill. But what I started to find was these documents referencing this chemical being in the landfill in massive quantities. But when I first, started looking for information, it wasn't on any of these lists. So I assumed, well, this stuff must not be bad, right?
Yeah, and I just have to say, the first time one of my toxicologists came to me and said, normally what you would do, you'd dose up monkeys to see what the long-term chronic effects are at the end of it. And normally what you do is you wait to see if they develop cancer. So at the end of a certain period of time, sometimes years, you check for
Right.
tumors, you euthanize the animal and you check, but they were already dead.
Correct.
In the cages.
And some of these monkey studies were back in 1978. I mean, this was information that had been decades old. So I'm reading through all this, and none of it's really making sense. But again, I was working with a lot of big chemical companies, and my law firm did. And one of the experts that we had used over the years was an analytical chemistry expert, and I had sat down with him and said, "Hey, did you ever hear of this stuff called PFOA?" And, he said, "No, not really. But I thought I saw an article recently about something similar called PFOS." And it was that article you just showed. It was the article that had shown up in the New York Times talking about 3M having agreed to recently stop making this stuff. And so the expert's telling me, hey, PFOA, PFOS, maybe they're related. If 3M has just agreed to stop making this and is going to cost them, as you pointed out, hundreds of millions of dollars to do this, maybe you ought to ask, what is this stuff? And so that's what really got me down this path to start asking DuPont, I want all of your information about this chemical. I want to know everything that you exchanged with 3M about how this stuff was made. And that's what led to what became over 2 decades. In fact, what we started to do was when I started digging through all these internal documents as part of our court case for Mr. Tennant, I was seeing all of these studies, all of this information, indicating that this stuff was pretty toxic. It was persistent.
Whatever it was bad. Yeah.
And what I was also seeing, though, was a lot of information suggesting that this was being kept confidential within the company. They weren't sharing this with the agencies. And in fact, there was debate back and forth. Do we tell anybody about this? And what I was seeing is the decision kept being made, no. So in 2001, actually it was March 6th of 2001, so about 23 years ago, I put all of this information together that I had found within these internal files, all non-confidential, it was not marked confidential by the company. And I sent it to the EPA. And I started doing that. I started trying to funnel as much of this data to the agency as possible so that they could understand, hey, this stuff's out there. And even though 3M had told them a couple of years ago, we're going to stop making this, what 3M hadn't told them was it's already, though, gotten into the drinking water. And it's already getting into everybody's blood all over the country. So I was wanting EPA to know, hey, this stuff still is presenting a real threat. So I was trying to get as much of this information to the agency as I could and was sending them letter after letter.
We were always impressed by the really sophisticated way in which you challenged the agency to act on these chemicals based on the laws they were supposed to be implementing. All kinds of triggers were being engaged by these chemicals. There are Safe Drinking Water Act issues here. There are Superfund and Toxic Substances Control Act issues, Clean Air Act. Practically every statute was violated by the presence of these things in the world, but they went unscathed. And the companies knew, as you say, that these were problems decades before they told anyone.
Absolutely.
Unbelievable.
And in fact, in my initial letter, I had cited all the different federal laws, that could have been used to try to crack down on this. And in fact, It was after we started funneling this information to the agency that they finally began what they called a priority review, which started in late 2002 under Charlie Auer at the EPA.
I remember
And
Charlie,
they
of
started
course.
doing
Yeah.
their very first risk assessment of the chemical. And at that point, they had finally become aware that this stuff was in the general U.S. population's blood. So they started looking at the exposure levels nationwide and looking at this toxicology data that was saying this stuff could really be a threat. And in 2004, the EPA actually then did sue DuPont, saying, you did withhold information from us under different federal laws, some of the same laws we had cited a couple of years earlier, under the Toxic Substances Control Act. And this is information you should have given us. And if you had done what you were supposed to have done, we might have begun to regulate this many, many years ago. And so now the EPA was sort of in this catch-up mode, trying to figure out what's going on. And eventually they even extracted a fairly large penalty from 3M for the same thing, for having withheld information about these chemicals under the Toxic Substances Control Act. But, it was the citizens. It was folks like Mr. Tennant and the attorneys that were having to give this information to the agency because the companies had chosen not to. They had simply sat on it and covered it up.
Yeah. Well, it was worth billions to them to keep it secret. I guess they, obviously they made the calculation. That's even in some of the documents that you've unearthed that they talked about it. Well, we could switch to something safer and better, but it might have an impact on our business. What has been your experience, Rob? I mean, you fought these discovery battles against DuPont and I suppose eventually 3M as well, and you won them to get the right to see what the companies knew and when they knew it. And then you took the extraordinary step, and it is extraordinary, unfortunately, I wish more trial lawyers would do it, of getting those documents into the public domain via submitting it to EPA. What is the kind of impact that those documents have on regular people when they see them in a court setting?
Yeah, it's a huge impact. And in fact, that was so critical to advancing all of this. We were getting a lot of pretty incredible documents from the internal files of these companies, memos, that would lay out pretty clearly their analysis of, yes, we know this is presenting these problems, but, now we've got this, we're making a lot of money off Teflon and, what should we do? And to see that in writing and to see that this was actually happening, that people were actually making these decisions. This wasn't just an accident that this all worked out this way. That was incredibly important. And that's one of the reasons I was doing what I could to try to get those documents to the regulators so they could see. This isn't just a plaintiff's lawyer out in West Virginia saying this stuff. This is DuPont and 3M's own scientists that are making these conclusions, that it's a potential carcinogen and that it's persistent and, the safe level ought to be less than this, et cetera. So it was incredibly important to get those to the regulators. But it was also even more important to get those documents out to the public. I pointed this out in the book, Exposure. It was so important for what EWG was doing at that time. You guys were you were some of the first people that were taking these documents that were available in the public record at EPA or in our court filings and getting them online. These were the early days of the internet and websites and those kinds of things. But EWG was able to make these documents available to the public in a way that had never happened before. Up to this point, you had a DuPont PR department, a 3M PR department that were controlling the narrative. But EWG was able to then put this information online and present it in a way that the public was able to understand. For example, your report back in 2003 about the pollution in people, to help people understand why this matters, why this is important.
Yeah.
And that really, I think, helped push the EPA to really begin to finally take some of these actions we talked about, the lawsuit that followed in 2004. And, it was important that the regulators understood the public now knows what's happening too, and is demanding that we do something about it. That was incredibly important to how this whole story finally came out.
I want to jump to something I've been curious about, which is, how this affected you personally. In Dark Waters, there's a wonderful sequence where Ruffalo portraying you and Anne Hathaway portraying your wife, where you talk about this court case as being much more personal than you ever dreamed it was. And that somehow it dawned on you. You were reading documents and you realized that these toxic chemicals you were trying to help a family deal with, the tenant family, the pollution of their farm, then ultimately a class action suit in the vicinity of Parkersburg, that these chemicals were also in your kids.
We live right down the river from that plant in West Virginia, right along the Ohio River. I mean, our local community draws its drinking water out of the Ohio River. All right. So we're right downstream. My mom and my entire mom's family grew up in Parkersburg, and I had to watch my mom deal with cancer and my wife's mother deal with cancer. And it's considered Cancer Alley through here. So, I mean, this was something that I really felt a personal connection, personal impact from, because I could see it, the way it impacted these communities all up and down the Ohio River here. And to some degree, sort of just accepted, that this is the way it is. We live in Cancer Alley and, we've got these companies, and you see some of that portrayed in the film, with folks that are, essentially saying, we need these jobs. And this is this company is helping
towns.
us, put our kids through college. It was definitely something that impacted personally. That's for sure.
Yeah. I'm constantly trying to make that connection to people for these chemicals and lots of others. And I worry about scaring them too much, paralyzing them. Is it too much information? What can I possibly do about it if it's all around me already? How did Sarah absorb it all, as so to speak?
As you mentioned, I mean, I started off my career at what would be viewed as a fairly conservative law firm in a very conservative town in Cincinnati, and have a fairly conservative background, and my wife as well. And so the whole idea that companies could be purposely doing this or intentionally allowing something like this to happen, that took a long time to really sink in and be able to accept that. And I wish I had really been more willing to understand what was really happening a lot sooner. I think what finally really started to resonate was when we were seeing the amount of cancer in this area, that the actual real impact that this was having, and seeing, as you pointed out before, seeing these things in these documents themselves. There were many times I would come home and show my wife, show Sarah,
who's a lawyer.
Yes, who is a lawyer as well. Had worked for a large law firm representing big companies as well. I would come home and show her, look, can you believe that this is actually in writing, that this actually happened? So it was a process with her as well, to actually accept that these systems may not be working the way they're supposed to. The legal system, the regulatory system, even the scientific process by which all of this testing is supposed to be done. And if the testing shows a certain thing, then it's supposed to move on to this next phase so that people are protected. Doesn't necessarily always happen that way. So that was a long process to sort of awaken, shall we say, to the way these things really transpire.
I mean, we've worked on pesticide issues. We worked on air pollution issues, all kinds of things at EWG. But really, the story that unfolded as we were learning about PFAS and the government's inability to grapple with it, it made me suddenly think that there really are two regulatory systems. The real one that is largely in the control of the industry. They have the agency because they control the information. So they're really making decisions for all of us as to what chemicals will be produced, which ones will be added to products, put into the environment, our air, our water, ultimately in us. That's sort of the real regulatory system. And then there's the children's table regulatory system, right? That is sort of almost a elementary school, how a bill becomes a law kind of artifact. that is constructed out of legislation that assumes companies are going to behave in a certain fashion, that science is going to progress in a certain way. I think that's why Steve Johnson, back in the day at EPA, was so, insistent that someone keep an eye on this. And we were the first group to do it. And fortunately, I had these brilliant scientists, people who could really read this information. And then they started seeing stories in the literature of where these chemicals were found. It seemed like Canadian scientists were well ahead of the game. And then we had some whistleblowers at 3M and at DuPont. It was really a revelation that, you can't take for granted that the government is doing the wrong thing necessarily, because they just don't know in many cases. It's not like they're willfully doing something wrong. That does happen. I think the government does just buckle under pressure, from political pressure from companies. No question about that. But sometimes the agency just doesn't know. That's like you're in the Matrix, right? And you suddenly you take a different pill and you realize, oh my God, all of this is a construct.
Absolutely. And, I think the PFAS forever chemical story is a perfect example.
Yeah.
Here you had so much information about chemicals that was frankly just withheld from the agency for many, many years, from way too long. But by the time that information finally got to the agencies, and the agencies finally started to realize what had happened, then they're met with the argument, well, now that we've successfully, kept this under wraps from you guys for so many decades, this stuff is now everywhere. It's in all of these products. It's contaminating, everybody's water and soil. It's in everybody's blood. This is now too big for you, agency. And you can't take this on, because if you do, it'll shut down the economy. It'll have all economic impacts and et cetera, et cetera. So because they so successfully kept the agency in the dark, by the time the agency finally figures out what's happening, they're told it's too big for you now.
Too big to fail. Yeah.
I mean, it has taken decades, all right, for us to finally get to the point where the agency's got the information it needs to begin regulating just one of these, even just PFOA and PFOS, 25 years. Even though you had all these animal studies, you had worker studies, you had human data the companies themselves had done, they were told, that's not enough. The agencies can't regulate that. It wasn't enough data. And so we did all those massive human health studies you saw in the films with the C8 science panel and all these studies of 69,000 people. And that took 7 years. So we finally get that done. Well, then you're finally at the point where the agency says, okay, we're going to finally move forward. And, here we are in the year 2024.
Yeah.
And we're just about to have that happen. And what happens? The companies take the chemical and they change it just a little bit. Instead of C8, they knock a couple of carbons off, or some of them maybe even add carbons. And then they say, oh, we don't make that chemical anymore that all the science exists on.
Yeah.
Right? We're now making these, quote, new chemicals. You don't have any science to say those are bad. And so we're told we have to start all over again. And so the agency, finally gets to the point of where they're about ready to move. And then they're told, we've moved the goalpost on you again. And so it's incredibly frustrating process, because I think most people in our country would assume if there's something that's toxic, persistent, bioaccumulative, carcinogenic in our water, we have agencies that are in charge of telling us that, and they would certainly tell us what's a safe level. Well, not necessarily. This is the example to show how that doesn't always happen and why that doesn't happen. How do we fix this process so that this doesn't keep happening? And it's a real challenge.
But the other thing you did was, when there was a settlement in your class action case, you made part of that settlement be, let's find out the real truth about this. And say a little bit about that, Rob. I just admired that so much, although it then resulted in 7 years where we were waiting. It always seemed to me that it was a personal thing with you that you shared with your clients, that, by God, we could take cash here and end this whole thing, but you wanted to do something else. I just admire that so much, that you came up with that idea.
Well, yeah, I mean, the problem we were dealing with is at the time we were settling this big class action case out in West Virginia around 2004, what we had been seeing when we were fighting with DuPont in court was that despite all of these internal studies, all of their animal studies that were showing all these problems, all of their own worker studies with humans that were showing problems, the company was still saying, and so was 3M, that's not enough. That's not good enough to show that this chemical can actually cause harm at the levels the people in the community are exposed to it. Oh, well, maybe there are some workers that have problems, but they're highly exposed. And so you need data saying that this can actually happen at the levels these people are exposed, and there is no such data. So when we sat down to settle that case and we set up this panel, we knew that what the community really wanted to know, even more so than the money, was, can this chemical actually make us sick? And remember, part of our group that we were representing included all of the DuPont workers. Okay, these were our class members as well who had been told, don't worry about this. So we really wanted to give them an answer to, can this chemical actually cause harm? And we knew it needed to be from independent scientists, people that weren't on the payroll of the plaintiff's lawyers or on the payroll of DuPont, people that both sides, including DuPont, could add confidence in. This is the real scientific answer. So when we sat down to resolve this, one of the things DuPont had done is they had given us $70 million, which was supposed to be, given out to the class. And I think they assumed we would just cut checks to everybody and walk away, right? But what we knew is we needed data. We needed to fill this gap that the company kept insisting was there, that there had never been a big enough study involving tens of thousands of people that could actually find these cancer effects. Because what their scientists were telling us is to find that something can cause cancer, you need tens of thousands of people. Well, nobody had ever done that.
We never do that.
We decided, let's take this money and actually give it out to everybody by saying, if you come in and give us a blood sample and give us access to your medical records, then we'll give you the check.
So not only are we not going to pay you right away, we're going to do a bunch of science, and you're going to have to give your own blood and family blood to make this whole thing work. And they overwhelmingly responded.
Right. We had great local counsel, Harry Dietzler and Larry Winter, the folks we were working with that really understood that this community, really, that's what they want. They would agree to this. And again, nobody had ever done it, so we weren't sure. But we presented this plan, and the entire class approved. The court approved. And so we started setting up these sort of mobile units all throughout the community. It was a great job by a local group called Brookmar, two heads of the local hospitals that set all this up. And pretty amazing process where they ended up getting 69,000 people who came in and participated. And that was critical because that was the big enough data set to finally show these effects that the companies had been denying. But we were sort of victims of our own success because there was so much data. Well, that takes a long time to analyze all that data and to go through and do all these different epidemiology studies. So that's ended up taking 7 years. But that was the critical missing piece to show that, yes, this chemical can cause these same things that they had been seeing in the monkeys and the rats and in the workers. Yes, it does present these health threats to people drinking it. And that was the data set, I think, that finally also convinced EPA and others to move forward with regulation.
Yes. I mean, that was really substituting for what the government, would never have been able to do, is developing science of that caliber. And then the government was able to order tap water testing, and people saw it in their local paper that this chemical they'd sort of heard about, or chemicals, were showing up in their drinking water, and normal utility filtration didn't take it out. Let me just jump forward a little bit now. We're recording this in the first week of April. We're expecting sometime soon that the Environmental Protection Agency will announce a legal limit for the first time on any of these forever chemicals in your drinking water. You've been extremely dedicated to telling the story on Capitol Hill, a whole series of hearings that unfolded there. When Dark Waters came out and Mark Ruffalo came to town, you testified next to him. I could barely tell you apart as the two of you testified. He's that good, right? But now we're seeing a very different set of headlines. It feels to me we're right at the beginning, really, of regulatory action. There have been steps taken. There are states that have established legal limits, but this is the big one. And the settlement that's just been announced for 3M. I mean, you must be feeling pretty good about it. For us at EWG, it'll be going on a quarter of a century next year.
Yeah.
And we've only been around 30 years.
Right. Yeah, it's been like 25 years. I look back at this and think when the science panel finally came out with its findings in 2012, I went back to EPA at that point and said, okay, what else do we need now to move forward with these drinking water standards? Because remember, our letter had gone out to them in 2001. And so here we were in 2012. And at that point, what we were hearing was, well, okay, maybe we do need to start looking into this. But in order for EPA to regulate something on a national basis, we have to first determine that this is a nationally occurring contaminant. And really, we don't have data from all over the country. So that's when, as you pointed out, EPA finally was able to begin requiring public water systems to start sampling for PFOA and PFOS. And as you pointed out, sure enough, it got found almost all over the country. Well, that led to this whole new wave of mitigation, and we're now representing hundreds of cities and dozen states that are trying to make sure that the costs of filtering that out, all right, are borne by the people who created the problem.
It doesn't show up on your water bill. It should show up in the ledgers of the companies that did the polluting.
Exactly. So you have all of these new cases that have been filed, and a lot of these cities and everybody, they're saying, look, we're being told now that this stuff's in the water at levels that are too high, and we're having to spend millions of dollars to clean it up. And what we were hearing, of course, from the companies was, well, nothing is requiring that to be done. Well, that's why it's such a huge development to have EPA say, no, we are going to officially regulate these. And even as we were about to take the very first case to trial for one of these cities that's dealing with this stuff in the water, in Stuart, Florida, we were able to reach settlements with the DuPont companies, which is now a group, as you know, they spun off into Chemours and 3M. And combined, it could be up to $13.5 billion. That's just for the public water. And I think you're seeing a lot of that development because we have now the top federal agency saying, this stuff shouldn't be in the water, and setting very stringent levels. And as you pointed out, we're looking at an agency that last year or so said they're looking at levels that could be around 4 parts per trillion for PFOA and PFOS. And just to put that in perspective, that's about the lowest level you can detect this stuff in the water, all right, with maximum contaminant level goals of being 0. So it really gives you an idea of how far we've come. But it's rather ironic because if you step back and look at the history, when DuPont sat down to come up with its safe drinking water, and they were the first people to do so back in the 1980s, because of course, nobody else knew about this, but their own scientists had actually said no more than about 0.6 parts per billion in the water. Well, the reason that's important is because at the time, the analytical methods that existed back then, that was about the lowest you could detect it in the water. So here we are finally at the point where US EPA has access to as much information as finally now as DuPont did. And they're now basically coming to the same place DuPont was decades ago, which if we can detect it, it's a problem.
Basically no safe level.
Correct.
Yeah.
And to see that actually happen will be huge, to see, because for decades, what we've heard from 3M, from DuPont was there's no science suggesting these present any threat and the levels in the drinking water don't present any harm. So I think it will be vindication for the scientific community and for all of those who've been struggling to make sure that the true facts and the true science actually does get out. And I think we're almost there.
I have to say over the years, there were a couple of things that I really had regrets about. One was, and you touched on it, the agency had to do tap water testing across the country before they could make certain decisions under the Safe Drinking Water Act. And I remember discussing with colleagues early in the 2000s, should we be testing tap water around the country? Because we did that for other things at EWG. We'd commission a laboratory. We'd have volunteers or our own staff go around and collect samples. And we found pesticides in drinking water, every spring when it ran off the field. So we tested baby food for pesticides. We had done a lot of this. And I remember we all concluded, well, maybe it's only localized around Parkersburg. Maybe we won't find it because the companies weren't really required to disclose laboratory testing techniques either. When we tested umbilical cord blood, we had to pay the lab to develop a method. This was in the early 2000s, looking for some of the forever chemicals there. We all should have pushed harder at EWG to do more independent testing. Ultimately, we did it. And the other regret I have, and I don't know if I've ever told you this, when we started getting in DuPont's way, I knew people in the company and they would come and talk to us at EWG. This was around the time that EPA was in discussions with DuPont and I guess 7 other companies to phase out 2 of the chemicals, PFAS and PFOA, which eventually happened. But as part of that phase out, I remember hearing someone from DuPont say, well, we've carved out an exemption for firefighting foam because that's a, absolutely critical use. And I remember thinking, well, I don't know if it's critical or not, but I would have a hell of a time fighting against that in the court of public opinion. My gosh, what if a jet airplane catches fire or crashes? How would you save people if you couldn't use this stuff? But of course, firefighting foam that's laced with some of these chemicals is one of the main sources of contamination of drinking water around the country near airports and military bases. We've published a lot on that on the EWG site. And when they said, Ken, how are we supposed to put out these fuel fires without PFAS? I blinked.
First of all, on the testing, as you pointed out, it would have been incredibly difficult back then because DuPont and 3M kind of had contracts with these labs that they had exclusive contracts. And it's not like you could just go to any lab and get the water tested or get people's blood tested.
Oh, we've been turned down. We've been turned down by labs on all kinds of stuff because their business model is to work for the industry.
Right. And, it was very difficult. We had to actually go to court to get DuPont to make the methods available so that we could get our blood testing done. And on the firefighting foam, the program you were talking about, which was the PFOA phase out, all right, in 2006, part of what we've been able to uncover and finally been able to reveal through this latest litigation I was telling you about, where the settlements were just announced with the firefighting foam community, is, there was an active ongoing program to mislead the EPA during that period of time to suggest to them that PFOA wasn't connected to the firefighting foams. Firefighting foam was a PFOS issue, and that there really wasn't any ability of PFOA to be in any of these foams because it wasn't intentionally added in there. Even though what we now understand from the documents is that the companies understood very well that PFOA could be in those foams, whether intentionally added or not. And it was, in fact, pretty clear that both of those chemicals were there. So, the EPA and everybody was being misled at that point in time with the firefighting foam connection and PFOA. And it's led to, unfortunately, continued years of use of these materials out in the environment.
Yeah, we're still fighting it. We're fighting to get the military to move away from it, fighting to get airports to move away from the bad stuff. And of course, ignite the search for alternatives. That's the way the economy is supposed to work. I remember reading some of the documents in the PFAS saga, the forever chemical saga. That's true in other realms too, where you see that the lawyers in the companies are worried about liability. The business people are worried about profit and revenue. And the engineers are like, just give me the spec. Why didn't you tell me you wanted it safe? I'm an engineer. I solve for those kinds of things. You just said you wanted a lot of it and it had to be cheap and it had to have these various properties, shedding water, shedding oil, sticking to liquid flames. So just tell me the spec, I'll design to it. And that's what we're seeing now in alternatives in all of these areas being developed. People are making money developing the alternatives. People are making money finding new ways to effectively test. We practically had to bleed people to death to get enough blood to do an analysis of PFAS in their blood. And now there's a finger prick test.
To me, that's really the value and the importance of what you guys have been doing for years, getting this information out to the public and the ability to finally educate the public about what these chemicals are and what products they might have been used in. Because having that information out there, it's at least fueling consumers to stand up and say, hey, we don't want this stuff in our food packaging or our cosmetics or our firefighting foam or clothing. And that is forcing companies from market forces to actually act to take these chemicals out or to switch to other things because of the market well before the regulations even change. So I think it's so important, to get these stories out and to help provide that information to the public because again, that's driving the change, and it's happening even before the regulations change because there's a market out there for it.
Now, I remember one of the meetings with DuPont, they said, we're having trouble selling Teflon for pots and pans because of you guys. And I would go to the store, then it would say PFOA free or, PFTE free, all referencing this family of chemicals. And that happened before the agency said, take it out of pots and pans. It was the public saying, surely there are ways of frying an egg without exposing my family to this toxic stuff. One of the things we've noticed about the PFAS saga, the forever chemical saga, is that over time, because it has demonstrated just how bad chemical contamination can be, way beyond DDT in terms of the impact I think it's had on the public, it has also brought to life, and I credit you with this too, Rob, it's brought to life some environmental laws that have been sort of moribund for years. And the one that, of course, comes to mind is the Safe Drinking Water Act. We've been writing and researching, publishing in the scientific literature for years about contaminants in drinking water. But one of the things that pops out that it's even hard to get reporters to believe that all these new chemicals that have been discovered, including the Aaron Brockovich chemical, hexavalent chromium, we still don't have legal limits on it because the water utilities have been so reluctant to incur the costs of treatment. They don't have the ability to regulate, but we do see environmental awareness coming to light, I think, over the PFAS crisis. Has that been your perspective too, Rob?
It has. And you step back and again, when I started off my career, I thought we had this incredible system. I started off learning what were all of our federal environmental laws, the different statutes, the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, the Superfund Act, the Resource Conservation Recovery Act, Toxic Substances Control Act, the whole acronym soup, right? And hundreds of pages of regulations. And so it seemed like an incredibly comprehensive, all-encompassing system. And I think what we've seen with the PFAS story is how little that actually regulates. When you realize that something escaped that system, how do you ever pull it in? This is not the way it should work. But also realizing moving through the regulatory process is going to take, years and years. So I was trying to come up with a way to do this through the court system again, kind of do what we had done in West Virginia, where we were able to create an independent panel of scientists that were looking at this chemical, PFOA, and doing independent research to confirm, yes, this chemical can cause harm, so that people were able to move forward and get it out of their water and get compensated for cancer and other diseases.
Yeah.
That's the only way that's happened, by the way, is through the court system. So I was trying to figure out how do we do this on a bigger scale to say, we now know that this same chemical is not only in the blood of the people in that community, but it's in everyone's blood across the country. But it's also mixed with these other chemicals now, the other PFAS chemicals? How can we require the studies and the testing to tell us on a national scale, is this stuff going to really present harm? And if so, how do we get the proper testing and studies done for it? So in 2018, I had filed a new case in Ohio where we were seeking to represent a nationwide class of everyone who has these chemicals, PFOA, which we already know is linked with these diseases, mixed with at least one of these others, and to have new science panel and new studies. And we fought for years against the companies, 3M and DuPont and others, who said, that's not an injury. Having this in your blood is not an injury. You have to wait till you're actually sick. We finally prevailed on that, and then we had to fight over whether we could move forward as a nationwide class. We got the court to agree with us in 2022 that we could move forward, at least at that point, on behalf of everyone in the state of Ohio, so about 10 or 11 million people. And at that point, the company said, no, this is too big. And they immediately sought an emergency appeal saying, you can't possibly certify a case like this. And we fought over that. And unfortunately, the companies were able to convince the appellate court that there was inability to show whose chemicals these were that were showing up in their blood. And so now we're dealing with how do we move forward now, finally, to get past this hurdle. So it's a never-ending battle, but one we're going to continue to pursue because, again, the one avenue we've been able to use successfully here throughout the last several decades to get people relief has been our court system. And we're lucky in the United States that we at least have that option because, as you pointed out, there are people now dealing with these same chemicals in Europe, in Japan, in Australia, and other places all over the world. They don't have that ability. A lot of those folks, they don't have court systems or legal systems that allow them to do that. So hopefully, if we're able to do it here, it'll generate information people can use all over the world.
Well, let's hope so. And you've been so generous with your time. I always enjoy catching up with you. And, you've been a big part of my career personally and instrumental to EWG's trajectory. We're very proud of having been the first group to step up and see that this was an issue. Equally proud to say that we've been an ally as you've moved forward at every phase. You've been such a great citizen advocate who happens to have an exceptional amount of knowledge and insight into a specific problem, but you didn't have to come to Washington and testify all those times. You didn't have to do any of that, but you did it because it's the right thing to do. PFAS, forever chemicals in all of us and everywhere in our water and in our air and our wildlife. That's no way to treat a planet. Thank you so much, Rob Bilott, for giving me one more episode. This has been a good one.
Thanks so much, Ken. It was great talking to you. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me to this historic occasion. If an organization can be considered to have a life's work, PFAS is surely it for my organization, Environmental Working Group. Sorry. And this is the best PFAS day I've had in a quarter century. Thank you for your courage and your persistence and your fealty to duty. You've set us on the right course. At long last, I know you'll stay the course because we can't go back.
Thank you so much for joining us today, and thank all of you out there for listening. If you want to learn more about our guest today, check out our show notes where you'll find additional links. Make sure to follow our show on Instagram at Ken Cook's Podcast. And if you're interested in learning more about EWG, head over to ewg.org or check out the EWG Instagram account at Environmental Working Group. If you liked this episode, send it to a friend and please leave a review. And our show's theme music is by Moby. Thanks again for listening.